Who are the world's richest authors, and what can you learn from them if you want to take your writing to the next level and perhaps start earning a good living from your work? Hi there, my name is Brian Collins. Welcome to the Become a Writer Today channel. So I've spent months reading about the world's richest authors and what they do, and I've also taken some courses from them. In this video, I'm going to profile 8 of the world's richest authors and give you some writing advice that can hopefully help you with your craft and earn a little bit more. One of the world's richest authors is probably no great surprise to you. Her name is J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, and she's worth an astonishing $1 billion plus, a lot of which she's planning on giving away to charity. Now, I'm actually not a huge fan of the Harry Potter series. Personally, I prefer Lord of the Rings. But that said, several years ago, I did visit Harry Potter World in Florida, and it was a fantastic place to visit. And it really made an impression on me about how, I suppose, how a writer can take something that they've written in their books and how it can be turned into lots of different experiences for fans of their work, like amusement parks and films and so on. So what writing advice can you pick up from J.K. Rowling, whether or not you're a fan of Harry Potter? Well, it turns out she's written an article all about her writing process on her website, jkrowling.com. She recommends a number of books that writers should pick up and which they should read. Speaking of reading, that's probably the piece of advice that stood out to me the most, because she said this is especially helpful for younger writers, that you can't be a good writer without being a devoted reader. Reading is the best way of analysing what makes a good book, noticing what works, what doesn't, and what you enjoyed it. And at first you'll probably imitate your favourite writers, but that's a good way to learn, because after a while you'll find your own distinctive voice. So the key takeaway from JK's work is that you should read authors that you admire, authors that you want to emulate, and don't be afraid when that happens, because that's part of the creative process. And it's only through reading and then trying to imitate them that you can develop your own style over time. James Patterson is another hugely successful author who's worth over $750 million. That's an astonishing amount of money, and it may be down to the fact that he puts out 3 or 4 thriller, mystery and other types of books a year. So here he is pictured with Bill Clinton on a book that they collaborated with called The President is Missing. Now, I picked up this book in an airport when I was going to Austin, Texas on a long haul trip from Ireland several years ago. I got about 200 pages into the book and then I put it down, because personally J.K. Rowling and James Patterson aren't for me. That said, I still appreciate what James Patterson does. He has a really distinctive style and he has a way of telling a story that moves along quite quickly without forcing the reader to think too much. In other words, when you pick up a James Patterson novel, you know what you're getting. And that may explain why he's sold so many books over time. I actually took a writing course from James Patterson on masterclass.com, which I'd recommend any creative or writer take if you want an insight into his process, because he talks all about how he collaborates and how he outlines extensively in advance. In other words, he doesn't labor over his sentences and try to get them perfect. He's more interested in finishing a story, shipping it and moving on to the next one. And he actually said this fantastic, or he offered this fantastic piece of advice too. Somebody said the key to life is to work hard, play hard, rest hard, and I've pretty much adapted that. So in other words, if you write intensely when it's time to write, and then remember to take some time off, then perhaps you can adopt a little bit of the creative mindset of James Patterson too. Stephen King is worth an astonishing $400+ million. He's one of my favourite authors of all time. I'm more of a fan of Stephen King's older books, for example books like Misery, It and The Shining, but I do occasionally pick up a newer book by Stephen King if I'm looking for something that's over 1,000 pages long that I can really sink my teeth into and use to forget about what's happening in the real world. But perhaps the Stephen King book that's had the biggest influence on me, and which belongs on your shelf if you're a writer, is his book on writing, which is one part autobiography and another part information about the craft. So he offers lots of great advice about how to use adverbs and so on in the book. But perhaps the piece of advice that has the biggest influence on the writing community is his mantra: write with the door closed, rewrite with the door open. So in other words, when you're writing your first draft, don't worry about what friends, family and neighbours will think. Don't worry about the quality or if it's any good. Your job is simply to get it out of your head and onto the blank page. Then, when it's time to rewrite with the door open, set your manuscript aside for a couple of days or a couple of weeks so you forget about it a little bit, and then start showing it to a critical friend or a critical family member or to people in your writing group. And then use that feedback to approach it with a critical editor's mind and to rewrite it and to fix it. Now, Stephen King is also a big advocate for reading, like J.K. Rowling, and in fact he says if you don't have time to read, you don't have the time or the tools to write. And in On Writing, he talks about some of the great works of literature that have informed his craft over the years. Danielle Steele is one of the world's richest authors. She's worth at least $385 million. Danielle Steele has a phenomenal work ethic. I'd say it's on par, if not in excess, of James Patterson. She's wrote, last time I checked, 179 plus books. In fact, it's probably quite a bit more than that because she churns them out or turns them out every year. She has some fantastic writing advice, which you may or may not want to apply depending on how you think about the craft and your personal life. So in this astonishing interview with Glamour magazine, which made headlines, she said, when I was first starting out, I had the same agent as Agatha Christie. I was 19 years old and she was in her 90s. So she's talking about her mentor, Agatha Christie. I met her once and I remember she said, I want to die face down first in my typewriter. And I feel that way. I mean, I want to go on forever just writing. And Danielle Steele talks about how she writes for 8, 10 and 12 hours a day, which is just insane because most writers and authors that I've read about or talked to or learned about find it difficult to stick with the creative process for more than 2 or 3 hours at a max per day. So she really does have a phenomenal work ethic. So even if you're not prepared to die face down in your typewriter or in your keyboard, perhaps you could apply some of Danielle Steele's approach when you think about your work ethic and when you're considering procrastinating about starting that next book. John Grisham is another one of the world's richest authors. He's worth over $300 million. And of course, many of his books, like Stephen King's books, have been turned into popular films, including The Firm and A Time to Kill. Now, The Firm is actually probably his most successful book of all time. But did you know it wasn't his first book? His first book, A Time to Kill, was published in 1989, and it was actually a bit of a flop. It only sold 5,000 copies. It was only after The Firm became so successful and became a film with Tom Cruise and so on that he really found success as an author. Now, John Grisham is somebody that I really love to read. Personally, though, I feel like his earlier works had more of a literary bent or a literary angle, and as the years went on, he kind of found a formula that works for him, much like James Patterson, that he's stuck with and which has helped him publish more books. He doesn't publish quite as much as James Patterson or Danielle Steele, but he's still pretty prolific. Now, his writing advice for you is, in life, finding a voice is speaking and living the truth. Each of you is an original, each of you has a distinctive voice. When you find it, your story will be told, you will be heard. And he has honed his distinctive voice over the years through learning what he enjoys writing and also what his readers expect from him. Paulo Coelho is another one of the world's richest authors. He's worth over $500 million. And of course, he's a Brazilian lyricist and novelist, and he's written over 28 books last time I checked. His books are a type of magical realism which some people love, or which millions of readers around the world love, and some people find a little bit harder to get into. They tend to have an underpinning metaphor or some advice that you can use to apply to your own life. And he often gets cited on social media as a result. Now, Paulo Coelho's biggest book is, of course, The Alchemist, and I actually read that book when I was in Brazil, so I was really able to sink into what he was trying to achieve with that particular story. In terms of writing advice, he says, when you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. So I guess that's kind of top level advice for your life as a whole. But in other words, if you want to become an author, then life will conspire to present you with circumstances which will help you to write. All you have to do is commit to your craft and to commit to turning up, so that when you turn up in front of the blank page or in front of the blank screen, you will be there if inspiration strikes. You'll be there to do the work. And of course, he has done the work because he's written over 28 books. And that's another key takeaway from the world's richest authors. They all have a huge back catalogue of books, and they all have published consistently and frequently until they found success. Tom Clancy is another one of the world's richest authors. He was born in 1947, and sadly he passed away in 2013. Some of his most famous books include the Rainbow Six series, The Hunt for Red October, and The Sum of All Fears. And of course, the movie star Harrison Ford has starred in a number of films based on Tom Clancy's works. Interestingly, Tom Clancy became a type of brand, and he still is a type of brand. His name is applied to video games, and from what I gather, some popular scripts are attributed to Tom Clancy, even though ghostwriters actually produced them. So he became well-known, or well-known enough to sell a film or to sell a story based on who he is and what he'd written about. In terms of writing advice, he said, the difference between fiction and reality, fiction has to make sense. And that's probably why his stories are so captivating. They always feel like they're set in the real world and that there's a lot of research underpinning his thrillers and his books. He also collaborated a lot with those involved in the US military, and he even co-authored memoirs of top generals and helped produce guided tours related to the US military. So he took something that he was really interested in and he used that as food and as fuel for his stories too. So ask yourself, what are you interested in? What do you like to nerd out about? Because chances are you can apply some of that credibility and research to improve the quality of your stories. The final richest author is worth over $200 million. His name is Jeffrey Archer, and his most popular book is Cain and Abel, which was published all the way back in 1979 and which has a number of sequels. It's a great book. It's something you can sink into, and it's a type of holiday read. He's actually well known for publishing these types of books that are all about dynasties and people involved in the media, politics, and those who are interested in acquiring power. That may be because Jeffrey Archer was also a well-known politician up until the early 2000s or the late 1990s. Then, unfortunately, he was imprisoned for perjury and perverting the course of justice for 2 years. That may have ended his political career, but it did not end his writing career. And he's been pretty prolific since then, and he has a huge cult following. In terms of writing advice, he says, decide when you're going to write, don't be casual, and only do it as and when it suits you. Don't think you can write a novel after you've done a hard day's work. It's insulting to those professional novelists who spend their time doing nothing else. And of course, he spends his time these days doing pretty much nothing else but writing. He describes how he writes from 6 to 8 a.m, from 10 to 12 a.m, 2 to 4 p.m, and 6 to 8 p.m. And he's kept up that routine, or will keep up that routine, for 40 to 50 days at a time when he's working on a book, and he hand writes every word. So again, Jeffrey Archer is somebody that you can learn from if you're interested in understanding the work ethic of successful genre fiction writers. So those are the 8 richest authors, or some of the richest authors in the world today. Hope you enjoyed the content in this video, but my key takeaway from learning from these authors and from how they work is that they all have a back catalogue, they all publish consistently, they all have a really strong work ethic, and they've all been doing it quite a long time. In other words, they're not, or they don't tend to be, overnight successes or flash in the pans, even though they may have had 1 or 2 hit books earlier in their career, like The Firm, or like Jeffrey Archer's work. They've also continued to publish and build on those successes and to hook the attention of readers. In other words, they treat it like a profession, they treat it like a career and not just a hobby.